I really rather like writing fiction. It doesn't have the restrictions that writing non-fiction has. I don't have to look up any references. I don't have to make any footnotes. I don't have to write an index or compile an index. I think it's a sense of um, greater liberty.
How did you dream up Michael Marco?
Well, I suppose the short answer is I didn't dream him up. Um, this reminds me of a friend of mine, a British academic, who was a great expert on Africa, who told me once that there could never have been a Somali like Michael Marco. And of course, that's completely wrong. There was indeed a Somali like Michael Marco. When I was Indian ambassador in Zambia, my Somali counterpart was none other than a person called Michael Marco. He was he was a person from Italian Somaliland. He spoke Italian, English, Arabic. He'd been in jail under the dictator Said Barre. His wife died in jail. He was a lawyer, and I presume that he was let out of jail because of Said Barre's desire to be forgiving or penitent, and he was sent as what we would call a political ambassador to Zambia. Now, he was a person who was extremely diffident, completely ignorant or unaware of any diplomatic courtesies. He would slink into diplomatic receptions and slink out again. Nobody took the slightest bit of notice of him.
Hi, I'm Karan Thapar. Over the last few years, I hope you've been watching my program, The Interview on the Wire. During that period, I've interviewed doctors, politicians, businessmen, scientists, authors, and even the occasional Nobel laureate. For me, it's been exciting. I hope it's been enjoyable for you. But these, as you know, are tough times, and if this program is going to remain bold, independent, and sometimes even defiant, then I think we need your support. At the end of the day, it's a truism, but editorial independence is best defended by the viewers. So if you would like this program to remain the way it is, forthright, outspoken, and interesting, then would you consider supporting us? All you have to do is to click on the description at the bottom. But more than anything else, I hope you will continue to watch the interview. Your viewership means an awful lot to me.
Hello and welcome to a special interview for The Wire. It's not every day that a former Foreign Secretary and a former Deputy Secretary General of the Commonwealth takes to writing detective fiction and does so with considerable aplomb. But that's what's happened in the case of my guest today. After decades in the Indian Foreign Service, culminating as High Commissioner to Zambia, Nigeria, and Bangladesh, as well as the ambassador to the Netherlands, he rose to the top of his profession as Foreign Secretary. On retirement, he became Deputy Secretary General of the Commonwealth in London. But now it's possible his new career as an author is how many will in fact remember him. Joining me to talk about the novels he's written and the characters he's created is Krishnan Srinivasan. Srinivasan, let me start with the obvious question. How did a former Foreign Secretary and a former Deputy Secretary General of the Commonwealth take to writing detective fiction?
Well, I don't think the two are necessarily related, Karan. When I was in America in the mid-70s, I did publish a couple of short stories in an international compilation of short stories, which were kind of whodunits, I suppose. But then there was a long pause, and It was only after I'd retired both from the Indian government and the Commonwealth, and after I'd published a few books already on international relations, that I dipped my toe, so to say, into writing novels. I began with the Writers' Workshop in Calcutta, then under Purushottam Lal. And then I wrote my first novel, which was The Ugly Ambassador. That would have been around the middle of the um, 2000s, around 2005, perhaps. So I did not really make a conscious attempt to get into novel writing. It just so happened.
Have you always wanted to write? Is this an ambition that's been lurking beneath the surface?
Well, I don't know whether, if it was an ambition, I think it's an ambition which hasn't really materialized into anything very significant. But I enjoy doing it. I must say that I really rather like writing fiction. It doesn't have the restrictions that writing non-fiction has. I don't have to look up any references. I don't have to make any footnotes. I don't have to write an index or compile an index. I think it's a sense of um, greater liberty.
Correct me if I'm wrong, but some of the earlier things you wrote were actually published under the name of your wife, Brinda Srinivasan. You were working in the Foreign Service in those days, and I presume that was the discreet way of doing it.
Um, I really find it hard to throw my mind back that far. I think, yes, I think in the writer's workshop, which I mentioned earlier, um, one or two um, one or two stories were published under her name. Um, I must say, without her permission, and much to her annoyance. So that stopped pretty quickly. Whether it was due to trying to maintain anonymity when I was in the government service, I can't quite remember whether that was so. Perhaps you're right. Perhaps you're right.
Let's come to the Marco novels. The central character, Michael Marco, in the sense of being the brain that solves the mysteries, is a former Somali ambassador living in India. He wears a crumpled dark suit, his socks droop, and his tie is askew, but he has a cherubic smile. Tell me, how did you dream up Michael Marco?
Well, I suppose the short answer is I didn't dream him up. Um, this reminds me of a friend of mine, a British academic, who was a great expert on Africa, who told me once that they could never have been a Somali like Michael Marco. And of course, that's completely wrong. There was indeed a Somali like Michael Marco. When I was Indian ambassador in Zambia, my Somali counterpart was none other than a person called Michael Marco. He was he was a person from Italian Somaliland. He spoke Italian, English, Arabic. He'd been in jail under the dictator Said Barre. His wife died in jail. He was a lawyer, um, and I presume that he was let out of jail because of Said Barre's desire um, to be forgiving or penitent, and he was sent as a what we would call a political ambassador to Zambia. Now he was a person who was extremely diffident, completely ignorant or unaware of any diplomatic courtesies. He would slink into diplomatic receptions and slink out again. Nobody took the slightest bit of notice of him. By chance, and I can't remember the circumstances now, I got to know him pretty well. And I found, to my amazement, that he knew much more about the liberation movements which were then congregated in Zambia, because as you remember, south of the Zambezi, south of a line going from Namibia to Mozambique through Rhodesia, the whole of Africa was under white minority rule. And all the liberation movements had offices in Zambia and were helped to some extent, to a greater or lesser extent, by by countries like India. What it turned out was that Michael Marco was the intermediary or go-between for many, many arms supplies to the liberation movements, um, uh, courtesy his country. I mean, the arms were not from his country, but they were from the Soviet Union, from the communist bloc, from China. And partly, of course, they were to help the liberation movements, but partly it was an anti-West gesture because the West was solidly behind these apartheid regimes. So he was very, very well informed, better informed than, I suppose, the rest of the gilded diplomatic corps put together. And that was my great advantage. And my first book, The Ugly Ambassador, was exactly about him and the liberation movements.
So Michael Marco is based upon a real human being who actually lived, who you met, who you knew, who you were a friend of, and whose knowledge of the liberation movements you admired.
Well, yes, he was certainly a living, sentient human creature. And as I said, it was my great fortune to have met him. He, I think, was dismissed again by the dictator Barre after his Zambia posting, but he then had an assignment as the OAU, the Organization of African Unity representative, at the UN. And I came across him again when I was in New York, and he was then working in the UN. And to my great misfortune, I really lost touch with him after that. I don't know, frankly, whether he's alive. I don't know whether he's read any of my books. I don't know whether he knows I've taken his name, literally, and made him a personality in my novels. I wish I did know. I can't find him on the internet. So all I can say is I greatly miss him, and I hope he would have enjoyed my novels if he'd read them.
Now, Marco is soft-spoken, self-effacing, gentle, and polite. His turns of phrase have a delightful archaic touch. For instance, he says things like, I have been found wanting in politeness. Isn't that the opposite of what one would expect or imagine of a detective? Usually, detectives tend to be upfront, outspoken, opinionated, and direct, almost the exact opposite of Michael Marco.
Yes, you're right. We're used to the American style brash detective, uh, Sam Spade and uh, Peter Marlowe, even I suppose Sherlock Holmes and people like that who are rather tempestuous characters. But of course, Michael Marco was not a detective. I mean, let's remember, he wasn't a detective. He wasn't a diplomat either. He was a lawyer and very well read, very well educated, enormously, uh, enormously um, uh, um, uh, with an encyclopedic knowledge of literature, but he was not a detective, and he didn't have the bluster that we're used to for detectives. He was a soft-spoken, mild, unassuming, unobtrusive character.
Now, in your recent novels, you've introduced a second detective, Koel Deb, a physically handicapped former senior police officer. She's often, in fact, in the recent novels, the narrator of the stories. What made you introduce her?
Well, she came into this Marco series quite late. You're quite right. The first 5 novels were only about Michael Marco as the central character. The last 3 have introduced a new person, Koel Deb. And the reason for that, I think, is that uh, the early Michael Marco novels were very political in nature, um, and the settings were political, and the field of work in which Marco was involved uh, was essentially political. Now, the longer my distance from international politics and diplomacy was, the less familiar I was with that terrain, and I had to move into a different type of story. I wanted somebody who was um, very familiar with the local circumstances, namely Bengal. And I also wanted someone who was energetic, active, investigative, and all the things that Marco is not. And therefore, I introduced, I think, with some satisfaction on my part, Miss Koel Deb, who is everything that Marco is not. She's female to start with. She's young. She's attractive. She's energetic. She's very dynamic, um, very hard-driven, and a former police officer. She came first in the UPSC exam for the government services. She chose to be a police officer instead of a IAS or IFS person. And she was, to my mind, the contrast with Michael Marco, and a deliberate contrast with Michael Marco, and I thought that they would make a good team together.
But what I'm intrigued by is the fact that you've given her a physical handicap. She wears a prosthetic arm. What made you give her that handicap?
Well, she had to have a reason for leaving the police, a much sought after government job in most people's estimation. So she was shooting up the ranks in the Bengal police, and she had the misfortune of being involved in a police encounter with a criminal, and got shot in the left arm around the elbow, and she had to have an artificial arm due to that injury, and the artificial arm was fitted in Bristol in UK, and she could no longer really work as a police officer. So she was invalided from the police. She left with a police motorcycle and a police pistol from a police auction of stores, and she set up as the only female private detective in Kolkata. So I was hoping that she would provide all the energy and the investigative aspects of the novels, as opposed to Michael Marco, who remained sedentary and thoughtful, and that they would complement each other.
Of the two, of Michael Marco on the one hand and Koel Deb on the other, who do you feel as author closest to? Which is the literary child that one could say you're most fond of?
Well, that's always a difficult question, isn't it? I think in many ways, every author would find it hard to answer a question like that, because creation is attraction, and you have these characters who strut and fret upon the stage, and they are your creations, and therefore it's really hard to pick a favorite. I would say probably that, I'm guessing now, that most authors would find it hard to choose between between the characters they create. I imagine that even Bram Stoker was fond of Dracula, and possibly Mary Shelley was fond of Frankenstein. I think whether they are heroes, heroines, or criminals, I think that authors tend to have some great affection for their creations. And in my case also, I think that is the same. Of course, I sort of lived, so to say, with Michael Marco much longer than with Koel Deb. But I think it was necessary at a particular point for there to be a contrast between Michael Marco and somebody else, which was of a completely different personality. And that's what I tried to achieve.
Now, Krishnan Srinivasan, as you know, the key to a good detective story is the plot. Yours are often detailed, frequently elaborate, and always very enticing. But how do these plots occur to you?
Well, it's another difficult question. I think my former colleague and good friend, very well-known author, um, Vikas Swaroop, he once said that no one has to be in difficulty looking for a plot in India, because all you have to do is to look at the daily newspapers for a week and you'll have enough plots to last a lifetime. Well, everybody has a different methodology. I don't find plots from the daily newspapers, I must say. As I mentioned earlier, my first 5 books were very political nature. There was Michael Marco and the liberation movements, then Michael Marco as a UN official trying to check whether the Libyans in fact were making an atom bomb. Then he goes to London, where he is investigating the sudden disappearance of 4 or 5 African ambassadors overnight, so to say. And then, of course, I bring Michael Marco to India, where he has different political connections, not by his own choice, but because of circumstances. Sometimes he's called for by the Indian government to help. There was a case of Indian TV team which disappeared in Sweden when they were investigating climate change activities. And there was another case of Marco being involved in a potential India-Pakistan conflict. So I think that plots were more difficult when I distanced myself from the political scene. They became more humdrum, if you like, more classical murder-type mysteries. And I think that, curiously, I usually begin with the crime and the criminal and work backwards, so to say, in finding out how the crime was actually committed. And Marco and Koel Deb investigate these crimes. And I'm more interested actually in the investigation than the crime itself. So it's the process of finding the pieces that make up the full picture that interests me more. So I begin, to answer your question, I begin with the conclusion, so to say, the crime and the criminal, and I tend to work backwards. And I spend a great deal of time thinking about the investigation process. And writing about it becomes a much more swift and easy operation for me, anyway. Each person has a different approach. For me, thinking about the plot is sort of 90% of the novel. The novel itself writes itself fairly easily after that.
Now, as I reflect on your novels, I notice that diplomats and embassies often feature prominently. Many of the novels are set in places where you've lived, places like Sweden, London, Africa, Calcutta. So how much of the novels is based upon your own life experience?
Very close, very close. Like I'm not a person who can easily imagine a different scenario from the one I'm familiar with. I could never write anything like Tolkien's stories, for example. I can't imagine a make-believe land. So you're absolutely right. The stories have followed, in many ways, my geographical journeys. And Michael Marco has been put into those landscapes, which I'm familiar with. I couldn't really adapt him into a landscape which I'm not familiar with. That in part accounts for Koel Deb also, because my horizons are now much more limited than they used to be. I hardly do any traveling. So the last three of my novels have been set in and around Bengal. And for that purpose, I did need to have a Bengali personality to accompany, handhold, if you like, Michael Marco. Michael Marco wants desperately to go back to his homeland, to actually Somaliland. Uh, and he has additional pressure because his passport is only valid for another few months, and he doesn't know whether he'll ever get another passport. Because, as you probably know, Somalia is in a state of absolute chaos, and the Islamic State has a very strong foothold in Somalia. So he wants to go back to Somaliland, which is in the north, which is relatively more peaceful, and he wants to set up a children's charity there in commemoration of his lost infant daughter. And Koel Deb wants to join him in this enterprise, and Marco's got tremendously delayed because he's trying to work out the legal aspects of setting up that charity in Somaliland and in Bengal. Now, I think that it's because my own geographical experience doesn't cover Somaliland. I'd love to write another book taking Michael Marco and Koel Deb to Somalia, but I'm afraid I'm not able to do that because I can't visualize Somalia in any clear way, and I can't write the novel without it.
Now, one of the strengths, as I read your books, is your description of people. You are very precise and you're very meticulous. For instance, you go out of your way to mention features like pointed noses with flared nostrils, papoose-like victimhood faces, or crumpled dark suits or white shirts that seen better days and drooping stocks. In real life, do you observe people and the clothes they wear very closely?
Not consciously. I wouldn't like my friends and acquaintances to feel that they were under a kind of close scrutiny or a microscope. But I find it easier actually to describe a person's attributes, or let's say to describe a person through their attributes, physical attributes, and perhaps their apparel and so on. I find it easier to do it that way, which is a little bit tangential, perhaps not as direct as it could be, but I find that technique easier. And I don't do it consciously. I do it almost instinctively. I think there always is some characteristic about somebody that you know, which is a characteristic specific to them, and that's what I try to bring out.
One of the characteristics that is specific to Koel Deb is her fondness for good quality shoes, and you certainly seem to indulge her. Whether they are Kylie P. heels, Ralph Lauren Barnsbury slip-ons, Skechers, or Shoetopias, she has a great interest in shoes, and I imagine this reflects your own fascination with footwear.
Well, I hope you don't think it's a foot fetish, but thank you for pointing that out. I would say that, Karan, my attempt is in describing Koel Deb's apparel is to try to suggest that while she was brilliant student and, as I said, came top in a nationwide exam, I say this and I relate this in some of these stories, that she is from what you would call a modest family in a modest part of Bengal. And I think she has a rather critical father who would have far preferred to see her as an Indian diplomat, maybe an ambassador. And she has a very understanding mother who's always supportive of her, irrespective of what she does. She's an only child. And I try to suggest through her apparel that she has great sense of insecurity. Having been invalided out of the police and being in a very tough environment as a female private detective in Kolkata, uh, probably the only one, she has to struggle for cases. She's helped greatly by her former police friends, that's certainly true, who all admire her greatly. And she was a very good colleague, obviously. But but she always has to wonder where the next rupee is coming from. She does a lot of cases pro bono because they are friends or friends of friends, and she has to sustain her standard of living somehow. And what I'm trying to suggest with the apparel, with her clothing, is that she is a woman who is insecure, and that insecure feeling, insecure sentiment emerges in the kind of lifestyle she lives.
But what does come across is her consciousness of how she looks and how she presents herself. What doesn't come across is the insecurity. I've never thought of her as an insecure person.
Well, there are times in the stories, the last three, where she is troubled by the possibility of not having any work and how she is going to sustain her lifestyle. She has nothing much to look forward to. I mean, she's only 35 or 36. She has nothing much to look forward to after her working days are over. She's not yet married, of course. Um, and uh, and I think she has that insecurity that most people would have at that age with the kind of profession they choose to follow.
Tell me, you've written 8 Michael Marco novels. In 3 of them, I believe Koel Deb features fairly prominently. Do you plan to carry on writing detective novels, or might you be tempted into other genres, for example, more conventional love stories, or maybe even a full-fledged autobiography?
Well, uh, you do me a great deal of credit by suggesting that. I've just published my eighth detective story. Came out a few months ago. I'm really not thinking of another project at the moment. Certainly not a non-fiction project, not a biography or autobiography or a memoir, because that's too much work. I've not kept any notes of my career, and I'm amazed by those who seem to have complete recall of incidents and people. I'm not blessed with that kind of memory. So I think that it would be much too hard work for me to think of a memoir uh, or any nonfiction book now, which would call for a good deal of research. I think that I would like to write another novel. I find that extremely enjoyable. I don't regard that as hard work. I regard that as a pleasant diversion from daily life. The trouble is, as I said, I think my horizons are now very limited. So it would have to be again about some environment which I am familiar with. And there are, I think, only a limited number of stories and narratives that I could deal with. Let us see. I'm also reached an age where uh, the effort requires a rather greater application than I'm capable of, perhaps. But I'd like to just leave that as an open question because while non-fiction work might be too much for me, I would like to, as I said, take Michael Marco and perhaps Koel Deb to Somaliland, but I doubt whether that will happen because of my lack of knowledge. But is there anything else, anywhere else I could find uh, for them uh, somewhere else, perhaps in India? I don't know. But I'll leave that open if you don't mind. So I would like to, but maybe this spirit is more important than the flesh in this case.
I wish you luck, Srinivasan, and I certainly hope that Michael Marco reappears at least one more time. Thank you very much for the time you've given me. Thank you very much for sharing the secrets of authorship and the secrets of the creation of Michael Marco and Koel Deb. Take care, stay safe.
Hi, I'm Karan Thapar. Over the last few years, I hope you've been watching my program, The Interview on the Wire. During that period, I've interviewed doctors, politicians, businessmen, scientists, authors, and even the occasional Nobel laureate. For me, it's been exciting. I hope it's been enjoyable for you. But these, as you know, are tough times, and if this program is going to remain bold, independent, and sometimes even defiant, then I think we need your support. At the end of the day, it's a truism, but editorial independence is best defended by the viewers. So if you would like this program to remain the way it is, forthright, outspoken, and interesting, then would you consider supporting us? All you have to do is to click on the description at the bottom. But more than anything else, I hope you will continue to watch the interview. Your viewership means an awful lot to me.